Chapter 23, Mixed Results. The landers didn't attack that night, or the next day, or the next. That had me more worried than if they had attacked. It meant the landers weren't worried about us. They were just going to speed up their work. So we decided to lead another, bigger attack on their primary operational capabilities. Fatima stayed behind this time, getting both grinders and miners prepped to leave at a moment's notice. We approached in two groups of diggers. Elena's was leading group 1 with the goal of attacking the landers' garage and taking out some of the big transport vehicles. The only problem was that we really had no idea where it was. She didn't seem worried. Whatever we destroy will hurt. Jimmy went with her in his digger. I was trying something else. None of us had spent much time in the docking area of the colony, but we'd seen it in bits and pieces, and we'd all arrived here through the landing pad. The main medical center, the processing plant, and the administrative buildings for the colony were there. We were all fairly certain we remembered one main ring road that connected all the silos to each other and then to the loading dock. I was going to take it out, or at least a big section of it. Mandeep and Finn joined my group. We couldn't break through the surface, that would leave us exposed, but we could weaken the ground under the road. The risk this time was that we'd be doing our digging while the landers were actually using the road. It was the safest way to mask any vibrations we'd be giving off, and we'd be giving off plenty. We kept strict radio silence, but I had plotted a pattern into everyone's map. We fired up our diggers and then began cutting carefully, keeping our directional arrows pointed straight ahead. We cut 4 parallel tunnels under a 200-yard stretch of the road. If my calculations were correct, there was barely a foot of rock left between the road and the holes we were leaving behind. I could even see cracks appear in the ceiling as I paused. Chunks of rock began to fall and ding off the hull of my digger. I nosed down just a touch. I didn't want the road to collapse while we were directly underneath. My original plan was to come back and cut across the tunnels to further weaken the road, but now that wasn't necessary. I turned on my radio and tapped 3 times. The others tapped back and we left. I kept my eye on the rear camera display and slowed. After a minute, the huge track of a transport vehicle broke through the hole. Mission accomplished. We headed back to camp, washed up, and began prepping lunch. I stared nervously at my watch. Elena was supposed to have gotten back almost at exactly the same time we had, but she hadn't. Halfway through my lunch, Elena's digger finally shot through the tunnel, sliding and skidding. She threw open her cockpit and looked around the tunnel. She was hyperventilating. "Is Jimmy here?" she asked. "Is he back?" "No," I said. She slammed her fist into the side of her digger. "What happened?" She leaned against her digger and rubbed her hand through her hair. "It started off well. We found a garage, collapsed a wall, and got out of there." "You destroyed some transports?" She nodded. "But then I had an idea." She stole a look at me and then lowered her eyes. I winced. I had a bad feeling about where this was headed, but I let her go on. "Jimmy was used to digging near the surface, so he agreed to try breaking through." "What? Why?" "It was just for a few seconds. We wanted to sneak a quick look at the setup to help us get some visuals of the ship, its location, the number of landers." I began to pace back and forth in front of her. "Go on." Elena began to shake. "I don't know what happened. He was supposed to take some pictures and then join me back in the tunnel. I never got a distress call, so I assumed he was fine." "We have to move camp. Fast," I said. Elena didn't move. I didn't care. I turned back toward the storeroom. Fatima was standing in the doorway. I wasn't sure how much she'd heard, but she was angry. "Fatima, you and Mandeep prepped everyone?" "Yes." "Then let's move." She nodded and hustled to camp. I shook my head at Elena, who stayed glued to her digger, hugging her arms to her side and staring at the ground. There was a low rumble from the walls. "Landers," I said, my eyes growing wide. There was a blast of rock, and Jimmy's digger flew straight toward us, the borer spinning. I lunged and pushed Elena out of the way as the digger smashed sideways into her cockpit. The entwined machines careened across the tunnel, sending out sparks before crumbling against the wall. I ran over. The digger split and smoked. There was a giant crack in the cockpit hatch, and Jimmy was trapped inside, packed in by dirt and rock. He was gripping his steering wheel, staring straight ahead, his face covered in grime. "Jimmy! Jimmy!" He didn't answer. I began clawing at the hatch. It gave, and I pulled the cockpit lid off. Then I began digging with my bare hands. Jimmy kept holding on to the wheel, white as a ghost. "Elena," I called. "I need help." I turned, but she was gone. Maria and Finn heard the commotion and rushed to help me. And together we were able to loosen the dirt enough to get Jimmy free. I had to pry his fingers from the wheel. I laid him down on the ground. He was shaking. Mandy ran up and covered him with a coverall. "Jimmy, it's Christopher. Are you okay? What happened?" He didn't answer right away. He just closed his eyes. Mandy took his hand and stroked it. He seemed to calm down, slowly. Good, she said. "Jimmy, did you get any pictures?" I asked. No, he sputtered. "I came up out of the ground and I was in the middle of a whole group of them. They had guns out and were running toward the garage." "Why didn't you drive back down?" I said. Jimmy closed his eyes again. "I panicked. I just sat there in the middle of them without moving, and then my disruptor turned off." Jimmy trembled again. "What happened next?" "Once the disruptor turned off, I knew I had to run for it. There was no way I could dig down fast enough." Tears began to stream down his face. "I knew the road had cracks in it from your raid, so I headed there. I just floored it and went right through them. I mean, really through them." He paused, sobbing. "Jimmy, did they follow you?" He took a few seconds to answer and then shook his head. "They just started shooting at me. They hit the digger again and again. I thought I was going to die." "You're alive. You're safe now," Fatima said. Jimmy shook his head. I was able to reach the road, and then I dug into the rock. But they must have hit the cockpit because the rock just kept pouring in. He coughed, and his hand was covered in muddy mucus. "That's enough," Mandy said. "He needs some rest." I got up and went to examine the digger. It was a total wreck. The camera and dashboard were completely shattered. It could have been so much worse. The landers hadn't hit the engine or anything that would have stopped him and allowed them to capture a digger. And of course, Jimmy was alive. "Christopher," a voice next to me whispered. It was Alec, of all people. I hadn't heard him coming. "Don't scare me like that," I said, catching my breath. "Sorry," he said. He was staring at the damaged digger. "Christopher, Jimmy looks sick." "He was in a battle." Alec nodded, but was silent again. "Alec, I know you've seen a lot. I know it hasn't been—" "I'm okay now, Christopher," he said. "I'm better." As if to prove it, he pulled the tattered remains of the safety poster from his pocket and let it fall to the floor. "They killed Brock, my parents, everyone I cared about, right in front of me." He closed his eyes. I put a hand on his shoulder. Alec took a deep breath and continued to stare at the digger. Then he looked straight into my eyes. His were narrow and sharp. "I want to help." I probably should have said no. He wasn't ready or wasn't prepared to deal with what our battles were going to be like now that the landers were aware of us. But something in his eyes told me he wasn't asking. Plus, with Jimmy dealing with his own trauma, we needed everyone's chip in. So I shook his hand and said, "Welcome back."